A big part of what drove me in my recovery journey, I'm sure this is probably true for you. I always felt like there was this voice in the back of my mind, or maybe deep down in my spirit, right? That was like, Mike, you could be better than this. You can live better than this. You can experience better than this. And so I wanted to be the best version of me. That's always propelled my recovery. Now, it's been kind of disappointing along the way because sometimes we disappoint ourselves.
And welcome to Miracles from the Hill podcast, where we share raw stories that display the anatomy of God's grace here at Miracle Hill Ministries. If this is your first time joining us, please subscribe. And of course, you can like, comment, and leave a review. To connect with us, visit our website linked in the description box. And now, here is our host, Ryan Dirk.
Greetings, listeners, and welcome back to the Miracles from the Hill podcast. Hopefully, welcome back. If not, welcome for the first time. We are in season 4, which is all about the reality of addiction and its solutions. If you'd like to hear more from the podcast, pause the episode, leave a review on whatever platform you're listening to. You can also follow the show to make sure you're the first to get new content. And as always, please email us at podcast@miraclehill.org. Man, tell us what you're thinking, ask us questions, suggest episodes or content, and we would love to hear from you. So on this episode, we're continuing to walk through kind of the tasks of the 12 steps, and some of these steps kind of get taken together, so that's what we're doing today is we're taking steps 6 and 7 together. That's hard to say 5 times fast. Which is all about how we kind of cleanse out the junk in our life. But we're excited to have Mike Malone joining us. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Ryan.
Yeah, good morning, sir. So Mike is the Senior Program Director with FAVOR, which is an acronym, stands for Faces and Voices of Recovery. Here, is it just local?
So FAVOR itself is actually a national advocacy organization, and then as an independent recovery community organization in South Carolina, there's other FAVORs across the state too, but we are kind of an independent 501c3, FAVOR Upstate.
FAVOR Upstate. And so the vision of FAVOR, and we're going to talk more about what exactly that means. The vision is the community embraces and celebrates recovery from substance use disorders as a positive healing force. The mission is FAVOR Upstate exists so that everyone affected by substance use disorders in the upstate region of South Carolina has a fighting chance at recovery. And I also added this because I thought this was great. The mission message. FAVOR Upstate provides a compassionate and innovative response to the suffering caused by substance use disorders for over 5,000 individuals in upstate South Carolina each year, rebuilding lives, healing families, and strengthening communities. And Mike, we've known each other, 15 years? Something like that. How long have you been with FAVOR?
I remember us first meeting in my early years of FAVOR, which was around the 2013-14 era.
Okay.
I didn't actually move to Greenville until 2011. So
10, 11 years.
Maybe in spirit we knew each other.
In spirit we knew each other.
But I think it's been about 10 years.
Yeah, been about 10 years. So the steps that we're looking at, we're going to talk about some other stuff before that, are steps 6 and 7. And I think it's interesting that Mike's here because you guys have kind of a broader platform of recovery, meaning that this kind of the 12-step ideology is not the only path, right? And I would agree with that wholeheartedly. We just happen to use kind of a Christian adaptation of the 12 steps. But I would contend and have contended on each one of these episodes about recovery that the tasks that are within the 12 steps are important recovery tasks, whether they're framed in the 12 steps or they're framed some other way. So step 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove our defects of character. And step 7, humbly ask God to remove our shortcomings. But we're going to come back to that. Mike, what in the world is FAVOR?
That's a good question, and I'll try to answer as efficiently and usefully as I can, I guess, because FAVOR really is a big idea and a big mission. To keep it simple, we are, like I said, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Mm-hmm. And more specifically, we're an RCO, or Recovery Community Organization. So we're actually registered with ARCO, which is the National Alliance of recovery community organizations. And we're CAPRIS accredited. That's the Council on Accreditation of Peer Recovery Support Services. So we
Lots of acronyms.
Yeah, we're nationally recognized. And I guess more simply speaking, we're a recovery organization whose mission is to serve individuals and families with substance use disorder in the upstate of South Carolina, helping them access and find recovery as best we can.
Okay, so on the website, it says that FAVOR is a movement, a center, and a family. What does that mean?
Yeah, what does that mean, actually? So as a movement, I think FAVOR's just riding the wave of the modern recovery movement,
Okay.
which, kind of started around the early 2000s. I think William White was one of the leaders and spokesman of the modern recovery movement. I don't know how familiar y'all are with William White, but if you ever want to check out the WilliamWhitePapers.com, he wrote a book called Slaying the Dragon, which is kind of a history of addiction recovery treatment in the United States. And it's just this idea of addiction is such an issue now in our country. We want to make sure that recovery is a realized possibility by as many people that are touched by addiction as possible. And so I guess we're a movement in the sense of advocating and, spreading the word and the experience of recovery. But we're also, what was the other thing it said?
A movement, a center, and a family.
A center. So we started out in Greenville in 2013 with our center here. FAVOR actually started as a 501c3 registered, with the state in 2003, but we opened our center in Greenville in 2013. And so as a center, we have a home base where we offer recovery support services.
Sure.
We facilitate individual support groups for families and those of us seeking recovery or in recovery. We do recovery coaching. We broker resources, help people find treatment. We've sent hundreds of people to Miracle Hill over the years, right? We help people when they get out of treatment. We have a lot of walk-ins. We operate a helpline, so we do some harm reduction out of the center. Anyways, so that's how we're a center. And since 2013, we've opened centers in Anderson, Spartanburg, and Oconee as well. So we actually operate 4 centers across the upstate. And we have hospital projects in Lawrence County, Anderson County, and Greenville across Prisma and St. Francis locations. And then finally, we're what was the last
thing? Family.
A family. I guess y'all can get in touch with this, right? Family is just that idea that we really care and kind of love each other, no matter where we come from and no matter how we identify as people in recovery, whether we're on the family side, the individual side, whether we're early in recovery, whether we've had a long-term sort of journey, or we're just somebody that's really confused and seeking help and doesn't know where to turn. So I think we're a community and we're a family of people in and seeking recovery.
And peer support's like a big thing that you guys do, right?
Yeah, peer support is kind of one of our core practices, so to speak. So everybody that works at FAVOR or volunteers for FAVOR has lived experience in either individual recovery from substance use disorder or on the family side of recovery. They've loved somebody or supported somebody in active addiction or in the recovery process.
Okay, great. So how in the world did you wind up in this career?
That's a good question too, and I think it's probably very similar to yours, Ryan.
Yeah.
I had found recovery myself in 2009, and I was just a very active member of the recovery community here in Greenville, and I knew the founder of FAVOR, Jane Presley. She came up to me at a 12-step meeting one day and just said, we're looking for somebody to occupy a role at our new center. She introduced me to the current CEO at the time, Rich Jones, and I wasn't looking to have a career in this field. I just enjoyed working with others and, being of service in the recovery community. And anyways, that led me to Rich through Jane, and Rich offered me a position, and I took it because it was an opportunity that seemed interesting at the time, and I've kind of been at FAVOR ever since because I really believe in our mission. And obviously it's given me a lot in terms of being a part of something bigger than myself and a cool career opportunity.
What were you doing prior to this?
I was I had moved to Greenville in 2011 from California. That's where I found long-term recovery. And for the prior decade, I'd pretty much been bartending, waiting tables, managing restaurants. And in Greenville, I currently worked at Devereaux's as a server and a bartender.
In recovery?
Yes.
In a restaurant?
I'm one of the unusual stories of somebody who actually did successfully wait tables and bartend and work in the service industry and maintain healthy recovery.
You're the exception, not the rule, right? Like that often doesn't work.
It seems like that.
It seems like that. Okay, so we're gonna walk through these tasks. So, up to this point, kind of the first 3 steps are about determining who God is and determining a relationship with Him. Then step 4 is about really inventorying our life. And then step 5 is really about sharing that inventory with others. If you're listening to the podcast for the first time, go back and listen to those episodes because they were before this one. So now we've kind of done an inventory. We've shared that with somebody, and we get into this idea that we have recognized our own brokenness and we're ready for some of that stuff to go away. Step 6 talks about this idea of getting ready to get the junk gone. If it's junk, why would somebody not want it gone?
Yeah, that's a good question. If it's junk, why would somebody not want it gone? I can't really think of a good reason outside of the fact that maybe they're confused about the nature of the junk or how cool of an opportunity it is to get rid of it.
I mean, I think that some people, we become comfortable with stuff in our life, right? Whether it's good or bad. And so oftentimes the stuff that we know we probably should get rid of, that the world may say is junk, it's something that's very comfortable to us. I don't know why. In my mind, my mind's going to like pornography, right? Like people recognize that pornography becomes like this, other sexual addiction on top of maybe some chemical addiction, but it's also something that brings tremendous comfort to them, whether they recognize that or not, right? Like it's almost a secondary addiction. So when the step talks about character defects, what is that? What is a character defect? What are we looking at?
Yeah, that's another good question too. And I think to circle back to something you just mentioned earlier, that we're comfortable with our junk. Mm-hmm. I think that's a healthier way to maybe frame it up, because the junk is, for lack of a better word, I think maybe a coping mechanism.
Yeah. And
these are the ways that we've navigated the world for a long time, right? Whether it's whether it's rooted in a behavior like looking at porn, or it's kind of rooted in sort of some unresolved issues that date back to our childhood or
right.
our life experiences. And so I think it can be pretty frightening to imagine a life without that, right? Just like it was frightening for me to imagine a life without drinking or using every day.
Yeah.
So in the spirit of compassion, I feel like if somebody's kind of struggling with these steps, I understand the principle behind 7 to be humility. Mm-hmm. It's important to just kind of embrace this idea of humility, that maybe, there's something on the other side of this that's rewarding and opportunistic, that it might not be easy for me to sort of courageously approach it, but it is worth giving this a shot. And maybe it's not junk. Maybe it's just survival mechanisms and coping mechanisms I've used along the way to help me get to this place, right?
So I'm going off my questions a little bit, but one of the things that we talk about at Miracle Hill is this idea that addiction is the fruit, but not necessarily the root, right? Like there's other stuff going on. And in the very first episode that we recorded for this season, I kind of broke down how science has looked at addiction over time, right? Moral model, disease model, learned behavior, genetic predisposition, addiction personality disorder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so which one of those is correct? I contend that it's unique to the individual, right? Like there may be trauma in their past. There may be, other contributing factors. And so I think steps 4 and 5, the idea is that we're looking at our lives and we're trying to sift through the roots and figure out what roots are contributing, which ones are not. And then we get to this kind of idea, and now we have to determine which ones go or which ones are dealt with, right? Like it's easy for people in early recovery to think the epicenter of their problem is the substance, but the epicenter of their problem is them, right? Substance is some inanimate object that's contributing to it. And so we have to look at our lives through a very honest lens and determine those things that need to be plucked out. But that's tough, right? Especially if you want to blame shift away from yourself.
It's very tough, and I'm glad that you mentioned honesty, because that's another one of those principles I think that is behind the steps. It is universal whether you're a practicer of the steps or not. And a quick disclaimer before we get deep into all this stuff, because I think we are getting into some really cool territory here. Mm-hmm. You know, I have a bachelor's degree in nonprofit management, and I have certifications in addiction. You know, I'm a peer support specialist, a certified trainer of CPSS. I have a Rise Interventionist certification. But I am not a neurologist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychiatrist or a therapist. I also have 10 years of experience working with, well, actually, if you include my personal recovery journey, you know, nearly 15 years of experience working with others. So that's where I'm coming from. And I'll speak in general terms around all things that involve science, medicine, therapy, recovery, spirituality. But I like to think of addiction as kind of like you were. It's the fruit, not the, what did you say, root? It's the fruit, not the root. More appropriately speaking, the rotten fruit.
Yeah.
And there's some things underneath my addiction that really drive me to sort of progressively get worse with substance use disorder. And those things vary person to person tremendously. You know, I like the biological, psychological, social, and spiritual model. And I think you hinted at this. Some of the things that are sort of that we're getting to in steps 6 and 7 in terms of removing these defects of character are biological issues, you know, psychological issues, social issues, and of course issues that are spiritual in nature. And you know, my journey of recovery through the steps and beyond has really been a peeling of the onion kind of experience. When I came from a 12-step background, very traditional. You know, go to 90 meetings in 90 days.
Yeah.
Get a sponsor, read the big book, get on my knees in the morning, get on my knees at night. It was very useful for me. I went to 7 to 10 meetings a week for probably 6 years. Got into service, right? Making coffee, chairing meetings, doing H&I, sponsoring young men, or really even older men, and men of all ages. And I think for me, though, my journey with the steps has been a recurring theme, and I've done it many times myself and many times with other people. And so when it comes to peeling the onion, my first experience with 6 and 7 was very formal. It was just like out of the book. And it was a lot of behaviors that were identified. You know, I can't stop drinking and drugging. Please remove this from me. I can't stop being mad at my coworkers. I can't let go of my ex-girlfriend. Like, please remove these defects of character. But over time, it's been more of an understanding and an awareness that involves, like, well, some of my defects of character, so to speak, are really these coping mechanisms and these unconscious belief systems that really aren't my fault. They're just kind of something I picked up along the way. And it's been more about bringing awareness to those so that I can have some freedom from that and some opportunity to be something else. So
I think that the frame you just gave of like biopsychosocial, spiritual is an interesting way to look at this. Let's briefly kind of unpack each one of those. So like, what are biological issues that we would be examining in this?
Well, to keep it simple, if I'm somebody with, you know, substance use disorder that's seeking recovery, my biological issues are that I'm, you know, neurologically addicted to drugs and alcohol, right?
Yeah.
Like, it involves the limbic system, this idea of dopamine deficiency, where I'm basically seeking drugs and alcohol just to, not even really to get high or drunk anymore, but just to kind of maintain. So, and that involves all other sorts of physiological symptoms too, right? Like, I'm going to have withdrawal if I don't use and drink. I'm going to feel sick and nauseous. I'm going to sometimes have the delirium tremens. It depends on what I'm addicted to. And then, you know, when I go in, either I enter into withdrawal management through a detox facility, or kind of withdraw on my own, or I go into inpatient treatment. The first, you know, week to 30 days is going to be pretty rough biologically, right?
Yes.
But then you start to feel better. And a lot of times the biological sort of, at least the dependency on drugs at that level is sort of alleviated. Now, the desire to use that's psychological, I think that takes a little bit longer to go away. and that's connected to the physical. But that's what I mean by the biological. Like, it's a brain disease.
Yeah, and the psychological is often biological, right? Like, you create these neural pathways in your brain that say, it's payday, I use. It's a day that ends in Y, I use. It's morning time, I use, right? And those are actual chemical pathways in your brain that are convincing you that you have to do these things. I'm not saying that the person's not responsible for their choice, but their choice at some level seems preset in their brain, right? And I think that somebody looking at this from the outside who says, man, he just needs to stop using, right? Like, it's just not that simple, right? Like, there are biological mechanisms, some of which you're pointing to, withdrawal, things like that, that are convincing a person in their own brain that that is the only choice that they have.
100%. And, you know, the more that to be honest too, the more I learn, the more I feel like I don't know. Mm-hmm. And that speaks to the principle of humility that we're even talking about today. But I feel like you're hitting on an important concept. It's all connected. So we understand the biological is connected to the psychological. The psychological and the biological affects your social experience in the world, right? Your social experience affects your biological and your psychological experience. Or like, for example, a lot of active addiction involves isolation, or our worlds get really small. Mm-hmm. Well, when I isolate, I tend to sort of ruminate in a shame space more often. And that shame is psychological, right? But that drives me to limit my social experience, which drives me to biologically depend on drugs. So it's really this vicious cycle. And I think I like the idea that it's a disease of no choice. The more I use and drink, the more hijacked my brain becomes, and I'm less able to make healthy decisions, period. So that reduces some of the shame around it, right? And brings some compassion to the person who's actively addicted. I think that's important to understand.
So you talked about the biological, a little bit about the psychological. What about social? Like, what are social contributors that we're looking at in this framework here?
Well, I know in the 12-step community, we talk a lot about people, places, and things, and we still use that framework at FAVOR. You know, in early recovery, what's a good thing to sort of address? The people you associate with, the things you do, and the places you go, right? And I think that's very much speaks to the social. If my world involves going to bars or sitting at home in front of Netflix and, you know, drinking and drugging, my social experience isn't very healthy. If I don't have a job that gives me meaning and purpose in life, or involves like healthy relationships with other people, my social world might be a little bit limited. If I'm not taking care of myself in either religious settings or community-based settings otherwise, like 12-step groups, or I'm a member of the gym, or I'm a part of a rec league sort of softball team, I'm not going to have healthy social relationships. And so I think it's important to rebuild those and evaluate those for people in early recovery too.
So when I think about my own recovery journey, and I think about the psychological and social aspects of these kind of defects of character, one of the things that contributed was I didn't recognize that I was introverted as a human being. And so using very much became a social lubricant for me, right? Like, it made interacting with human beings a lot easier. And I also felt this social expectation to be part of the party, right? When in reality, I'd rather like be on my porch reading a book, right? But I didn't know that about myself. Yeah, I thought the expectation was being a party. And so I had to reset expectations around social expectations, and also a recognition of who I am as a human being, and that it's okay that I don't necessarily want to go to the party or be at the bowling alley or whatever, fill in the blank. I didn't bowl, but you get the idea.
That's a rite of passage in recovery. If you haven't done sober bowling, you got to sign up.
Hey, this is off topic, but you know, the times that I've been triggered the most in my recovery journey, which I don't feel like I get triggered often at all anymore, but in my first year of recovery, I went with a church group to a bowling alley, and we're sitting there, we're bowling, and it turned 9 o'clock, and the lights went out, and the black lights came on. I didn't know that cosmic bowling was a thing, but I was instantly in the club and I could taste the dope, right? Like that is a biological, psychological effect on an external trigger, right? Like in life, which is fascinating, right? And I had to get out of that bowling alley, right? Best intentions. I was with a church group, but it was terrible.
No, that's good. I'm glad that you brought that up. I don't think that's off topic at all. I think if we're triggered like that, we just have to be okay with it on the one hand. And I love your exit strategy. Just get out of there, even though you're doing something that's like a healthy recovery behavior. And that's a very natural experience for a lot of us in early recovery. The good news is if we give it enough time and we do sort of like get out of the cosmic bowling trigger without using, that kind of stuff heals and goes away. I'm willing to bet in your life today you could go to cosmic bowling without being like
I'm willing to bet that I could. I'm probably not gonna, but I'm willing to bet
that's because you don't like
fun.
bowling, right?
Yeah, that's probably why I don't. I'm not gonna be at a bowling alley at 9:00 at night, right? Like that's not in my season.
I mean,
of
I
life.
guess I'll speak for myself in respect to the social stuff. You know, I love to see live music, and the last time I actually returned to using was a year into my recovery. I went to a Fish concert out in California, and I had a recurrence. Fortunately for me, I dove right back into AA and was honest with my sponsor about it, and that ended up being the last time I ever used or drank. But a year into recovery, I just wasn't ready for that experience, even though I wanted to be. But now I go to Fish concerts pretty regular. Yeah, I go to I like this band called Goose. You know, I really just enjoy live music, and I can go and I'm not triggered to use it all, and I can enjoy just being myself there without having to be something else. And I think you spoke to that too. You know, you're kind of naturally an introvert. What you're saying to me is that you've become more comfortable with who you are in your recovery journey, and in your active addiction, you felt the need to sort of be something you weren't. And I think that's a character defect.
Which is, something. That was my point. It's a character defect that needs to be adjusted. I need to be okay in my own skin. Okay, last chunk of that, spiritual. What are like spiritual character defects that we're looking at?
You know, I don't know. I guess these are so unique to each person, right? But in my mind, spirituality is this idea of sort of getting outside of myself and addressing the things in this universe that are beyond just my egocentric self, the nature of my spirit, being a part of something bigger than me. And I think spiritual character defects would be kind of anything that cuts me off from that. All my self-centered sort of egocentric pitfalls. And some of those might be fight or flight mechanisms, you know, that I've developed along the way, Ryan, that's the thing. Character defects has such a negative connotation. I guess over the years, I've kind of identified them more as the things in the way of my best self. And those might be, you know, the need to, the sense of wanting to be more extroverted, but I'm actually an introvert. Or, you know, I had a difficult relationship with my mom over the years, and I love her to death now, and we've had a lot of healing. But I think there were some unconscious sort of fight or flight mechanisms within me rooted around my relationship with mom that I had no idea about, that drove me to try and be something I wasn't. And I know that's a little deep, but I think those are the kind of character defects, so to speak, that get in the way of my spiritual nature.
I think you made an important point about kind of positive versus negative. You know, when we talk about steps 4 and 5 about inventorying, I think most people in early recovery approach it from a very negative lens, right? Like they're looking for the broken places in their life. I was blessed to have this psychologist as a counselor when I was, approaching recovery. And he made me do this exercise. I'm trying to remember what he called it. I can't remember. He had a name for it. But essentially he had me write down 5,000 statements that started with I am. Okay? So you get about 500 statements in and you're like out of negative things, right? Like you run out of room. And so it forces you to define yourself from every possible angle. And you find that the positive greatly outweighs the negative. But oftentimes we look at those as just negative. And so we're only really looking at one part of who we are as a human being, about what creates our identity. And certainly the steps kind of lean that way, right? Like, because you're trying to get rid of the junk rather than the positive. So that becomes hard for people when all they're facing is their negative rather than their positive.
No, I wholeheartedly agree, and I think the steps afford us an opportunity to experience a different view of ourselves and a different sense of ourselves in the world within which we live. And there's so much negative in the way. I do think one of my things about the steps over the years is they do seem deficits driven, sort of like, let's look at all of your problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in that sort of peeling of the onion spirit, over time it has been as much about what's right with me or what's right with other people as it is about what's wrong.
Yeah, amen to that. Okay, so this step kind of forces us to acknowledge that it's not just the dope or the alcohol that is wrong, or whatever the addiction is, right? It could be a variety of different things.
Well, those are the behaviors, right?
Right. But it really points to the other issues that we're dealing with in this idea of our entire life needs to change, and it requires us to be extremely transparent with ourselves. How do you see people get to this, or how have you seen this be a stumbling block for people in recovery? Like, get to this place where they have to kind of face themselves in the mirror.
That's funny that you asked that. I'll share a story about my dad real quick. My dad's actually a person in recovery, but he did it much different than you and I did it. Very informal. And I would consider him to be a very spiritual and religious person, but at the same time, he's never been very big on 12-step recovery. Mm-hmm. And I've taken him to meetings with me, and I asked him one time, I said, what is it about the steps that bothers you so much, Dad? And he said, I just couldn't do that inventory thing. It's there's too much guilt and shame there. I don't have the energy to face all that. And so I think, why is it a stumbling block? I think for the exact reason you mentioned, people just get kind of overwhelmed with having to address all these sort of negative things in their past or within themselves, and it can be daunting. I want to encourage people, though, it doesn't have to be like that, right?
Right.
Again, this is an opportunity to just sort of look at ourselves differently and kind of review what's happened over the course of our life to open doors of possibility. That's how I see recovery as, a lot of times people say, they'll talk about like sobriety or recovery as a good thing. Sometimes I think that's a mistake too, because it's not always good. There are challenges that I face in getting clean and learning how to live well, sober or in recovery, right, that aren't always good. But I think there are opportunities. And the cool thing about putting the plug in the jug, so to speak, or, putting down the pill bottle is that it's not necessarily going to be good, but I definitely have an opportunity to experience something different that could be a lot cooler. And that's what I feel like if you embrace this idea of sort of inventorying your life, inventorying yourself with a little bit of courage. I think that's the principle behind the fourth step, right? I think it's courage.
Yeah. So, and people that find steps kind of 4 through 7, right? Like inventory, confession, dealing with what's busted about you, and then asking God to remove it. People that get stuck on that, arguably that's what leads to white knuckling it through recovery, right? Like you're just forcing yourself not to use rather than looking at the roots. All you're dealing with is the fruit.
No, exactly. And, in the spirit of multiple pathways, I feel like people with good recovery, you kind of hinted at this earlier, they might not even formally do this, but I think this happens for them.
Right.
So they don't have to white knuckle it. They do repair relationships of the past. They do kind of forgive themselves of all the things they've done. They do change in ways that help them be a better person one day at a time, right? They might not have done it through the steps, but I agree, if you don't experience that, it's pretty hard to be free of that psychological desire to use. And that's a white knuckling sort of unfun experience.
So again, you guys deal with a bunch of different paths. Like you're dealing with all these different programs and perspectives and outpatient recovery and all this different kind of stuff. The one thing that they seem to all have in common is this coalescing around a healthy community, right? Like, so AA and NA world, for people who aren't of a religious faith, AA and NA kind of becomes their God, right? Like it's that community.
The group is a power greater than yourself.
Yeah. And so if you have a healthy community, you're by default doing these tasks, right? Like you're going deep about who you are with other people who are trying to go deep about who they are. So you kind of automatically go through these things. Now, arguably from a Christian faith perspective, you know, I obviously think that Jesus is the best answer to this, right? But I will say this. I say to the men and women and overcomers in renewal, if you want easy recovery, this ain't the right recovery, right? Because, you know, when Jesus calls a man, he bids him come and die, right? Like I'm asking you to trade in your addiction for following a creator who wants you to lay your life on the, you know, on the altar. So doesn't mean that it's easy. How does fear work against somebody trying to address their character defects?
You know, that's funny that you say that because I'm currently facilitating this intervention with a family right now, and we identify the person in addiction a lot of times as the POC. This isn't very much an aroused model, the person of concern POC, and the POC was just showing all the telltale sort of symptoms of not wanting to go to inpatient treatment, right? Mm-hmm. They wanted to spend more time with their kids. They were worried about being away from their wife. They were scared of, the deal breaker for them was they couldn't have a iPad so they could read their books. And it just driven by fear, right? Consumed by fear. And I think fear is such a symptom of our addiction. And so how does it get in the way? I think it just gets in the way because it's kind of all we know. And again, I think back to the principles, if you can just embrace like giving these steps a shot or just giving recovery a shot, however it looks for you, with some courage, the outcome is totally worth it. And it's not easy, Ryan. I don't think it's easy, but I think it's nothing, you know, nothing worthwhile is really.
So I'm going to make a generalization. You see if you agree with me or not. In recovery circles, people love to talk how they're fighters. But addiction, kind of by definition, is a flight response, which is based on fear. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's interesting. So addiction by nature is a flight response. I think in many ways it is a flight response. But I'll reframe it like this. I think sometimes engaging in a flight response can be survivalist in nature. So it can be actually resilient until we know otherwise.
Say more about that.
For me, when I look back on my drinking and drugging, and drinking and drugging is sort of that way, that's colloquially how we refer to it a lot of times. So I'm not trying to perpetuate stigma there, but in my drinking and drugging years, it wasn't all bad times. Like it wasn't like it was then. You know, those last few years were brutal. My world was small. My relationships were crushed. My dreams were broken. My dependence on it was so high that I would be sick without it. But there were many times I had a good time drinking and drugging, and I don't think it was all a bad thing. Same thing with my fight or flight responses. I don't think my flight response through addiction in the end was necessarily like a weakness. It was actually something that was keeping me alive. So, and I didn't know how else to live. So it was very resilient. I guess that's what I mean. But is there a better way for me to go about coping and living one day at a time? No question about it.
Yeah. But in the moment, you're saying it was your survival technique, as unhealthy as it was.
Drugs and alcohol were a performance-enhancing mechanism for me. I couldn't go to work without a drink, Ryan. I couldn't go to sleep without a drink. I couldn't go back to sleep in the middle of the night when I woke up with the DTs without having a drink. So in a way, it was the only means of getting through one day at a time. Was that the healthiest way of going about living? Heck no. And that had some serious consequences, right? I mean, it was killing me on the inside physiologically. Mm-hmm. It was killing me socially. I mean, I was estranged from my family. My fiance was walking out the door. I could barely take care of my dog, right? Much less myself. It was killing me psychologically. I mean, my view of the world was skewed and unhealthy. And then spiritually, I was definitely bankrupt. I was not connected to this idea of something bigger than myself.
Sure.
So, were those some coping mechanisms and some survival skills that I needed to adapt and change and get removed through an experience like the steps? Heck yeah. But was it a weakness? I don't know. I guess it's just a matter of perspective.
Yeah, that's a heavy thought. If something is killing us, even if it's keeping us alive, killing us at the same time, is that weakness by definition? I don't know the answer to that. I want to say yes. I want to disagree with you and say that it is weakness by definition, but the idea of active addiction as resiliency because it is helping you to cope with life, even though it's super unhealthy, I think that's a fair way to frame it, right? Like you are surviving barely, and it might kill you, but it's the only thing that you have to survive.
Right. And man, I'm totally comfortable like agreeing to disagree.
Yeah.
And you got to remember, I'm coming from that framework of years of just kind of looking at addiction through this real compassionate lens. When I came up through my own 12-step recovery journey, it was framed up in the traditional way. You know, my name is Mike, I'm an addict, and I'm the problem kind of deal. But I'm just looking at it different. I think I can still say my name is Mike and I'm a person, you know, living with substance use disorder who has found recovery. But I don't think I'm the problem. I think the problem was I just didn't know any better.
You're saying, and I think biblically I would agree, that you have value despite this thing that's killing you.
No question about it. That's
Right,
why
yeah.
character defect, like some of these things are so naturally occurring in our world. I mean, God, it's so, you know, one of the reasons that innovative response to addiction that FAVOR's mission message talks about, the reason we practice harm reduction, the reason we embrace multiple pathways, the reason that we really value peer support is because the game has changed a little bit, man. It's almost harder now than it's ever been not to sort of like depend on drugs or alcohol to cope one day at a time. Our world is more disconnected in many ways. It's like this little device right here.
He's holding up his phone for those who are listening.
I'm holding up my phone, you know, this 2-inch by 1-inch little box.
Yeah.
It has a lot of power and it can be a very useful tool, but it can also be pretty destructive.
Yeah.
And I think in many ways this doesn't connect us more closely. It disconnects
No, it kills us.
And so just like I have a 18-year-old stepdaughter, right? And I have a 23-year-old stepson. And my heart goes out to them a little bit because of how just conditioned they are by having that as their, I don't know, fifth appendage.
Yeah.
And so that being, and you know, the opioid crisis turned fentanyl crisis, turned xylazine crisis, turned what's the one that nitazine crisis.
Is that the new zombie?
I think that's
zombie?
the new. Xylazine's the horse tranquilizer.
The horse
right?
tranquilizer.
Yeah. And nitazine is a new synthetic opioid on the streets, I guess, that's starting to like even make the
That's the
opioids.
fake carfentanil stuff.
I don't know
Yes.
if nitazine's. I just started hearing about nitazine,
Yeah,
so I'm
yeah.
not. Carfentanil's that really potent.
It's really
like you touch
potent.
it with your fingertip, and like
Yeah.
you could, you know, overdose. But it's so dangerous now. You know, people without even being addicts are dying because they bought a pill on the street, a pressed benzo on the street that had
Yeah.
fentanyl in it, or heaven forbid, there's actually fentanyl in some, you know, marijuana now that's being purchased on the street. I think that's the exception, not the rule, but. Anyway, because the game has changed, it's almost easier to become an addict than it ever was. The drugs we're using and misusing are more dangerous than they ever were, right? It's Russian roulette. I think that we've had to change our approach a little bit. And I love what goes on in Miracle Hill. I mean, I refer people here all the time. I got nothing but respect. And I love the steps and what they did for me in the 12-step community. But I do think it's important to just have this not easier, softer way, but maybe easier, softer entryway for people.
So this is getting way off topic, but I think that people will like the conversation. So Miracle Hill uses an abstinence-based approach to recovery. You're talking about more innovative solutions like harm reduction and medically assisted treatment, which I'll be completely honest with you, I struggle with the idea of medically assisted treatment. In my mind, it's legalized addiction, right? I do recognize that some people, their lives are being saved by it, but it goes back to the conversation we were just having about, like, if that is their coping mechanism, is that positive? And I've struggled to see that it's positive. So talk about the philosophy a little bit about harm reduction, medically assisted treatment, comparing to an abstinence-based model, which you and I both came through an abstinence-based experience.
Oh, my
right?
recovery is rooted in abstinence-based.
Yeah.
And I have some evolving sort of perceptions on that too. But yeah, let's talk about MAT and harm reduction. And I guess I'll try and even relate it to step 6 and 7. For one, I validate where you're coming from, and I can even relate to it.
Yeah.
Because over the years, even though I've changed my view of, buprenorphine, Suboxone, Sublocade, methadone.
Before you keep talking, let me. I'm just thinking that some of our listeners have no idea what we're talking about. So,
Right.
Harm reduction is the idea that you somehow make addiction safe for the person, right? It's the idea of handing out clean needles or providing safe injection sites, making sure that everybody, has anti-opiate drugs, or medically assisted treatment is, hey, I'm addicted to opiates, so I'm going to go here and I'm going to get a safe alternative that I take for some period of time. And let me qualify that by saying, in theory, I don't have an issue with medically assisted treatment. My problem is nobody ever gets off of it, right? Like if there was a guaranteed step down protocol associated with getting somebody on a different substance, I'd be much more open to talking about it. But I frankly have not seen that happen barely ever.
And to be clear, I think never's a unfair word. I think it's not always. I think it's common that people are on it for a long period of time. But I have worked with people who have come off it, and some people want to.
I have met a few.
But I do understand a lot of the clinics out there don't necessarily promote that, right? So that is kind of a challenge.
And that's a whole other conversation about who owns the clinic.
But back to your point about harm reduction, I think of harm reduction as the spectrum of that's rooted in just reducing harm. We want to prevent like infectious disease. We want to improve the quality of life of people out there actively using so they actually have a chance at recovery, because it's pretty hard to broker recovery to somebody who's dead, right? So fentanyl test strips, for example, are a form of harm reduction. At least if you come in and get some, you can test your dope and make an informed choice on whether or not to use it. That is like saving lives and keeping people alive long enough that they may actually find recovery. But the spectrum, as I see it, would be anything from like wound care on the streets or providing clean pipes to people who actually, it's not even just about opioids anymore, clean pipes to people who smoke meth or crack cocaine, to continue to prevent disease and just improve their health even while they're using. To abstinence is all the way on the other end of the spectrum.
Right.
Because, to be honest, Ryan, the safest form of harm reduction is not using it all, right? So I see it as the spectrum, but I think, so everybody understands what we're talking about. I believe that MAT does save lives. I think it does help people find recovery that otherwise wouldn't find it. But there are some challenges, and we don't have it all figured out yet. A big part of what drove me in my recovery journey, I'm sure this is probably true for you, I wanted to achieve this sort of greatest potential or this highest version of myself that I could be. I always felt like there was this voice in the back of my mind, or maybe deep down in my spirit, right? That was like, Mike, you could be better than this. You can live better than this. Mm-hmm. You can experience better than this. And so I wanted to be the best version of me. That's always propelled my recovery. Now, it's been kind of disappointing along the way because sometimes we disappoint ourselves. But I feel like if you're on medication for the rest of your life, you may not be achieving your highest self. On the other hand, in the spirit of quality of life too, I think your quality of life is tremendously improved over using a gram of heroin every day or, smoking a gram of meth every day. So it's a difficult sort of thing for me to accept. But I've worked, back to my experience, I've worked with a lot of people over the years that have used methadone and Suboxone and naltrexone and clean needles for a while that do have some pretty amazing lives in recovery now, even though they still might take Suboxone. And it's hard for me to reconcile that sometimes.
Yeah,
right?
It's hard for me to reconcile it. For the reasons I've already stated. It feels like they're still owned by something when there is a path away from that thing. And it's hard for me to even say that they're like, when somebody is on, pick one of those substances, and they talk about their clean time, I really struggle with that, right? Like, like in my mind, you're not clean. You're still owned to a substance, and that is, man, you're paying somebody for it. You're going to a legal drug dealer rather than an illegal drug. I just really struggle with it. If there was a guaranteed path, like you're on it for 18 months and then you're off, I feel like I'd feel much better about it. But, and to your point, there's people who do that, but I feel like that's the exception to the rule rather than the rule itself.
And a lot of the people I've worked with, even if they're on it long term, like beyond 18 months, maybe for the rest of their lives, I think the dose is relatively small at that point. I mean, most people I've been coaching or that actively go, use Suboxone or go to clinics still, it's, 1 to 2 milligrams a day. It's not like 16 milligrams a day or 200 milligrams of methadone. I think that's the exception. And, I do see these people having healthy relationships with their families, pursuing degrees and going back to school, having good jobs, helping a lot of other people. I mean, it's difficult to, I guess just through the lens of, well, you're depending on a substance, so, that's a bad thing. Because think about all the things we do depend on, either substance related or not, that are a part of our recovery. I mean, I drank a cup and a half of coffee this morning. I don't know about you.
Just finished mine.
It doesn't create unmanageability in my life.
Yeah.
But it is a substance I depend on.
For sure.
I went through, I feel like I've had all the in recovery addictions you could have, whether it's porn or it's food. And I remember there was a time where I was eating sugar just in a very unhealthy way. And it was a coping mechanism for me. Work had become so stressful. I just still was kind of struggling with myself in many ways. And I would eat Mike and Ike's, I would eat. It reminded me of alcoholism. I would eat like pastries to go to sleep. I would wake up in the middle of the night when I would have like the sugar crash, and I would eat pastries to go back to sleep. And I say all that because I was dependent on it in a way that wasn't good for me. But a couple years ago, I got off sugar. Like I quit eating it completely. I lost 20 pounds like that.
Got off sugar.
So I think sugar can be a drug too, right? But it's not like I was getting shamed in the rooms for eating donuts at the AA meeting. So I think we need to continue to have humility when we look at these things too, and just understand we don't know everything. Now, that being said, I completely respect abstinence-based recovery and faith-based missions and 12-step recovery. And listen, if it's incumbent upon a group, like an NA group, that their group conscience is, we don't consider somebody on Suboxone to be clean, but you're welcome to be a part of our group and share. I think they have the right to feel that way. Yeah. Right? I think y'all have a right to say, our Overcomers program, our renewal program involves complete abstinence, and that's just the requirement we have for our inpatient centers.
To your point, so I read a study years ago now that named 3 substances that if you can remove them in early recovery, your chances of long-term success are like dramatically higher. I don't remember what the statistics were, but the 3 substances were caffeine, nicotine, and sugar.
Interesting.
Chemically, those things,
not opioids.
That was automatically assumed. But
okay.
But ironically, if you ever go to an AA meeting or an NA meeting, what are the 3 substances you find at each one of those?
Caffeine, nicotine, sugar.
Right.
Caffeine, nicotine, sugar. Yeah.
They do the same thing to your brain, right? Like just in much smaller doses, they're releasing the same dopamine, just at a different level.
And nicotine's interesting, right? Like you might develop lung cancer or emphysema over time, but it's not going to crush your family, or it's not going to inhibit your ability to go to work every day and perform. Yeah. So, but it's still, make no mistake, it's an addiction that diminishes your life and your potential. So I don't know. These are, and listen, we're further than we've ever been. And I'm telling you, I see people like our SBIRT program, that's screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment in the hospital systems. Like, we have peers in the emergency department greeting people who are coming out of an overdose. Yeah. And it is so powerful for them to have the opportunity to get on some Suboxone so they can kind of like just change a little bit about their lifestyle. That opens up the door of possibility that is recovery that they otherwise just wouldn't have. They're just not going to embrace an abstinence-based, like all-in approach right away.
Well, last thing I'll say on this, and then we'll get back to some of these questions and get towards the end of the episode. So the tide in recovery, like nationally, is towards this idea of harm reduction. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, there is nowhere left in upstate South Carolina where you can get abstinence detox from opioids. It's all medically assisted treatment.
I think you can go to the Phoenix Center, and if you don't choose to be on Suboxone, they'll let you withdraw. They'll medically supervise your withdrawal from
Will
opioids.
they?
Yeah.
But the push is toward, and I'm not judging the Phoenix Center, but the push is towards.
Well, this is one of the
MAT.
challenges I do have with it too. You know, we started these medications for opioid use disorder trainings years ago, and it's a national movement too. And one of the things that I sort of have a little bit of a bone to pick with is we no longer broker abstinence as an option. It's like for people with opioid use disorder, it's like Suboxone or bust.
Yeah.
And I do think it's important that we continue to broker abstinence because some people on opioids don't want to do MAT. And I think they have a right, an inalienable right in their recovery journey to choose that too.
Yeah, amen to that. Okay. How are humility and courage, which you've pointed to already, a part of this kind of removal of defects and asking God for help process?
Well, courage is a little simpler, I guess. And humility is tough to talk about, so I'll address courage first. I like that saying we have in the rooms that courage isn't necessarily the absence of fear. It's sort of like walking through something in spite of the fear that I experience. So I think, again, if we can just summon any kind of courage to just take a chance, that's important. And it's important when we endeavor in the steps or in any kind of recovery journey. And then humility, I don't know. I'm curious to talk more about this. I love the idea of humility and the concept and discussing, but sometimes I feel like even just talking about humility is not humble.
Not humble.
Right? So.
Yeah, so I feel like from a Christian recovery framework, we do a good job at this because you can't avoid the idea from a biblical framework perspective, right? And
well, so what does it mean to you? Like, what's humility kind of like as it's understood through a Christian lens?
yeah, so man, you're turning it back on me. So, let's go back to the first three steps, right? So here's my summary, my Christian recovery summary. Step one, I'm no good. I'm a sinner, broke, busted, and disgusted. Step two, God is good. Step three, I'll put him in charge, right? So I think humility is the acknowledgement of who we are in comparison to a holy God, and then recognizing our need for him to be the driver in our life rather than ourselves. From a biblical framework, there's this idea of sanctification, which is the process of being made holy, which means that we recognize that we're a sinner, we're broke, busted, and disgusted. We recognize that God is the opposite of that, right? And our whole journey, our whole walk with Jesus is trying to look more like Jesus than ourselves. It's about, use the idea of the peeling of the onion. It's about peeling off all those layers that make us not genuine and our false self, and really acknowledging our relationship to a holy God.
Yeah, a lot of that does resonate with me, and I think I like the idea of wholeness. Humility in many ways is kind of a return to wholeness, or maybe a practice that is getting me there. I kind of like to think of humility as a practice too. It's like all these things. I never master honesty. I never master courage. I never master faith. I never master humility, but I can practice it. And I think, I've always, I have a very Judeo-Christian background, right? I grew up in Spartanburg, South Carolina. I've lived other places. I went to, boarding school in Massachusetts and lived in South Florida, and California is where I found recovery. So I've been all around, but I grew up in this part of the country. And so it was impossible not to have a Judeo-Christian sort of upbringing. We were members of the Methodist Church. And my early recovery experience involves going to the faith home in my mid-20s.
Yeah.
So that meant a lot to me. My spiritual journey has evolved beyond sort of that worldview to be true to myself. But I value very much my experience at the Faith Home and all the times I've had in church where it's this idea that, I'm not it.
Yeah.
Right? Something else is. However, at the same time, I feel like my wholeness journey of humility has involved this idea that, but God is in me too, right? Not just out here. And I think, in that sense, I'm not, broke, busted, and disgusted. I'm actually whole, wonderful, and amazing. And if I can, but it's weird, I've still got to practice a sense of humility to know and experience that and get beyond this egocentric Mike Malone identity.
And I think you're hitting on it, right? Like the egocentric is rooted in, again, from a biblical perspective, the root of all character defects is pride, right?
Pride.
Right? That was...
Have you ever read Mere Christianity?
Yeah.
I love that book. And I remember, God, what's the author's name?
C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis, yeah. I never really read something where somebody was kind of hammering on pride as much as he was. And his idea was, from a Christian perspective, that kind of the sin of all sins is pride. And that resonated with me.
It's the root.
And I think humility is kind of the opposite
It's
of
the
pride.
opposite of pride. That's right.
But in a weird way, don't you think humility also involves this idea of maybe a healthy sense of self too? Like, I'm not proud of me, but I do acknowledge, I do have some assets. Sometimes I have a pretty funny sense of humor.
So theologically...
I'm a decent writer.
Yeah.
That's not pride.
Theologically, so you said something 40 minutes ago that I just drove by. You said self-forgiveness, right? Which is rooted in this idea of our own self-esteem. And biblically, I don't think either of those two ideas are, certainly from a Christian perspective, are things that I should even consider. I can't forgive myself. I understand what you mean when you say that. And I even say that when talking to people in recovery, right? What I mean by it is you have to work through issues and move past them or come to peace with those issues. But I can't forgive myself. Jesus forgives me. And I can't have self-esteem. I esteem to be like Jesus, right? And so true humility is acknowledging that and wanting that, right? And what C.S. Lewis is pointing to, that original sin is pride, right? It's the thinking that I know better than God. And so then true humility would be acknowledging that I don't.
I get that.
Right? And I will say this, nobody accomplishes that, right? The only person to accomplish that is Jesus. And
this is just a never-ending journey.
It's a never-ending journey. It's sanctification.
I don't get there.
No, we don't get there. And I find myself being prideful more times each day than I care to admit on this podcast, right? It's something we all struggle with each and every day when we think we're in control. And if I'm thinking healthy, I acknowledge that I'm not. Right? That's humility.
Yeah, that's one of those paradoxes to control, because we talk about people, places, and things, right? And on the one hand, we tell people in early recovery, well, you can change your people, places, and things, but you can't forgive yourself. So what can I control and what can't I control? I guess this is for each individual to sort of identify. One of the things we teach in our multiple pathways of recovery modules now is this idea of locus of control. So some people identify with this kind of external locus, and I think it would be through kind of the Christian lens you're talking about. There is a power greater than myself. It's outside of me.
Yep.
It's not me. I can get in touch with it, right? But it's not me. And there's this idea of where this locus of control is internal, where I do have the ability to maybe forgive myself or overcome my addiction or make decisions. Smart recovery is really rooted in this. I don't know if you've ever been exposed to much of the smart recovery pathway, self-management and recovery training. I always thought it was, I'm open to this now. I don't do a lot of smart recovery, but my I'm trying to respect the anonymity principle,
sure.
Right? My 12-step recovery background involved this locus control that was very external.
Yep.
And smart recovery is all about self-management. 12-step was about selflessness, right? And so I always thought that was just an interesting thing. But I find people with healthy recovery in the smart world too. So I'm always like, what? That's interesting. You know, they look at it different, but they experience the same thing. So I think humility is still experienced by them too. And it's very much a recovery principle that's important. I guess it's just an individual decision on how you sort of frame it up and how you go after it.
I think that it goes to that idea of the God of our understanding, right? So for me, it's very clear who the God of my understanding is. It wasn't in early recovery. It is today. However you define the God of your understanding would define, by definition, your locus of control. And so, like, when you say self-management, my mind immediately goes to, I was the author of my own destruction, right? Like, I couldn't manage anything, right? That would be crazy talk to put me back in charge of my own life. But I've also, come to peace with, or beyond that, grown to value not being in control, right? Like,
yeah, me too. And I struggle with, a lot of times when I really just struggle internally, I feel like it's because I'm not in control and it just scares the crap out of me or it frustrates me.
Or it makes me mad, right?
Right,
Like sometimes
anger, man. Anger and recovery has been a whole journey for me too.
Okay.
But real quick, to put a bow on something we were touching on there, I think that's why it's so cool for us to have options. I mean, for somebody to be able to pursue humility through the lens of experience that you do, and for somebody to pursue humility through the lens of experience of maybe, make no mistake, when they go to smart recovery, they're still like putting their life in the hands of the smart recovery practice and the smart recovery group. And they're also turning away from like using and drinking, like this isn't working for me anymore. I think it's cool that humility is available in both arenas.
Yeah. So last thing, and I'm going to try to get to the end of the sheet of our questions. So step one, from a 12-step perspective, is this acknowledgement of our own brokenness, right? So what you're describing with smart recovery, I think, is what most people are actually after. I think most people get to a 12-step meeting or a recovery group because they want somebody to teach them how to beat their addiction, right? Like that is what the initial goal is. And most people breeze past step one thinking, I'm going to figure out through this 12-step process how to master this thing that is mastering me. When the first steps in opposition to that, it's this idea of acknowledging that you can't, right? In our world, we call it a human condition rather than alcohol or drugs or whatever the case may be. But step one also then would be rooted, truly understanding it in humility, right? And acknowledging that you can't be in control. And your best efforts, again, biblical perspective, your best efforts have resulted in filthy rags, right? Like that's the best you have to offer. Okay. Let me try to figure out where we are on this page now. All right. You've seen thousands of people come in and out of recovery. I'm sure that we have both seen hundreds of people lose their battle with recovery, right? What are the common things that you see people do that leads to them not being successful?
God, that's such a good question. And, when I think about this, I don't just think about the individuals. I think about the families that struggle too. And so not just, for example, I worked with this young man named Xavier for years. He'd been in and out of FAVOR, and he just fatally overdosed a few months ago. His mom gave me a call, so he lost the battle, right? But the families too, who they just can't kind of let go in a way, or they can't take care of themselves, even if their loved one's still struggling. Like I think in a way they're losing the battle too. So what are the common things I see? Believe it or not, a lack of humility.
Yeah.
And honesty. I think it can be hard for us in active addiction or active sort of codependency, for lack of a better word. I know that's sort of been, that word's been shamed over the years in respect to family recovery, but I think there's still something to that. There's this idea where you're addicted to a relationship so much you can't see the forest for the trees, right? Mm-hmm. I'm addicted to drugs and alcohol so much I can't see the forest for the trees. That's what an individual experiences. And I think people that can't get honest about that really struggle, bro. I think people that can't get humble and then really embrace the fact that they're not in control, like you're not in control of your heroin addiction and you're not in control of your family or your loved one. I think those people struggle. And my heart goes out to them, man. That's why at Favor, I think we want to ensure that everybody has a fighting chance. Even if you're continuing to not be honest, Ryan, even if you're continuing to not be humble, we want to meet you where you're at and work with you anyways. And we want to offer you the promise that recovery is possible and there is hope. But I guess, in short, I think the people that struggle with humility and honesty really, they have a hard time.
So when I've been asked in the past, what is Favor? Here's what I tell people. Okay, I don't know if you'll like my analogy or not, or my metaphor. I say Favor is like the hub on the wheel of recovery. You go to Favor, and Favor is going to point you to a different spoke, right? Depending on who you are and what you want out of recovery. They're going to help direct you along the path, whether it's to inpatient recovery or outpatient recovery or 12-step recovery or whatever the case may be. So there's inevitably going to be somebody listening to this podcast because they know deep within their soul that they need recovery. But they're scared. They don't know what to do. So what would you say to that person? How would you direct them back to you guys?
Well, first of all, I don't dislike your description. I think that's pretty cool, the hub on the wheel of recovery. I like to think of Favor as like a clearinghouse or like a portal, for the newest of new, the earliest of early families and individuals. People that don't even necessarily want recovery can kind of reach out to Favor. But what would I say? You could call our helpline. We have a daily helpline from 7 to 11, 864-430-1802, and just talk to somebody and ask some questions. You could come to an all-recovery meeting or one of our centers in Anderson, Spartanburg, Greenville, or Oconee. I think I like the idea of being sober curious, right? Get online and look up Miracle Hill, look up Favor, go to a Zoom meeting. We have Zoom meetings every day, Monday through Saturday at noon, and there's Zoom meetings all over the country now. Sure. Get on Reddit, if you're a social media person, get on Facebook and say, hey, what is recovery? How would I know that I'm an addict? I think get online and ask questions. Anything that you're willing to do to sort of like educate yourself or open yourself up to the idea of getting some help is worth pursuing.
So if somebody calls the helpline, who are they talking to?
So one of our peer support specialists, one of our staff mans the helpline every day. We have, a schedule and we rotate shifts. So they're talking to one of the Favor staff, and they're a person with lived experience in recovery. Actually, it's interesting. I never thought about this, but all the people that are answering the helpline are individuals, not families.
And they're
trained peer support specialists.
I'm leading you in this, but if somebody calls, the one thing they're not going to get from that phone call is judgment.
No judgment. Favor's definitely I don't think it'd be humble to say we're a judgment-free zone because every human being still struggles with judgment. But I would say Favor's a relatively judgment-free zone. Like, you're not going to be judged for having any kind of problem or any kind of family issue. In fact, one of the things that I take pride in around Favor is that I feel like we've made it more okay than ever to say, I have issues.
You've made it more okay to not be okay.
More okay to not be okay. And I think that's pretty cool because there's just one of the biggest perpetuators of active addiction is shame, dude, for families and individuals. And if we can reduce a little bit of shame, I think that all sorts of opportunities open up.
The more okay to not be okay, you know who really likes that? Jesus.
He does. He does. And
he
man,
does.
I'm a big Jesus fan.
Yeah.
I'm all about some Jesus. I think it's important to remember, though, that God means different things to different people.
Yeah. So last question. Sales pitch. What do you guys got going on at Favor? What would our listeners be interested in? Anything that we haven't talked about?
I'll tell you what, one of the reasons I have grayer hairs on my head than I did 10 years ago is because what don't we have going on at Favor? Sometimes, Leslie Perkinser's our new CEO, and she's really been doing a good job. But she wants to grow like Rich did, and sometimes I'm always behind the scenes like, can we slow it down? There's such a problem out there, right?
Yeah.
But what aren't we doing? I mean, we have peers in the hospitals. Like I said, we continue to expand our hospital program. We just got a peer in Lawrence County. We just got a peer in Greer, Easley Baptist, and we're actually putting one in Hillcrest. we're doing more harm reduction than ever before, right? We're just putting Narcan all across the upstate. We even have Narcan vending machines at all of our centers, believe it or not. And now Narcan is a form of harm reduction that doesn't involve using. So I want to make sure people understand.
Yeah, Narcan's the anti-opiate. We have it in every one of our facilities. All of our people are trained in it. I got 2 boxes of it in my truck.
That's
right.
Good to know.
You just never know when you're going to be interacting with somebody who's overdosing.
I'm trying to think of what is the most like cutting edge thing we've done lately. I don't know. We're always trying to bring in other outside groups to be a part. Somebody reached out recently about having an in-person Al-Anon meeting, and Celebrate Recovery reached out to us about having a Celebrate Recovery meeting at the center, and we'd love to do that.
Yeah.
So we're always looking to partner with other agencies.
Sure.
It's very important. We believe that recovery thrives in supportive communities, and that involves all of us working together, which is why I really appreciate you having me here, and I appreciate the partnership with Miracle Hill and all that y'all do.
Mike, it's a great conversation. I appreciate you coming in, sharing your wisdom and your experience. And if you don't mind, I'm going to close this in prayer, and we're going to be done.
Sounds good, brother.
Lord, we love you. We thank you for today, Lord. Thank you for my brother Mike. Lord, I pray that you would bless his endeavors, Lord, that you would help him to help others, Lord. I love the idea because I think it's one close to your heart to be okay with not being okay. Lord, and I pray that as Mike and Miracle Hill, Favor and Miracle Hill are both trying to help people that are somewhere on the spectrum of recovery, that you would help each one of those individuals to know that they are loved, that they have value, and that we want to care for them regardless of how they feel about their life, Lord, and that they have a friend both at Favor and at Miracle Hill. Thank you for the day. Bless us as we go out. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, Mike. Goodbye, everybody.
You're welcome.